Hello, my name is David R.M. Saavedra. I'm sorry I'm unable to be with you at AESA this fall, but I'm happy to be able to present my work here in this format. The title of my presentation, as you can see, is Disrupted Relationships, Moral Distress, and Teacher Professional Identity During COVID-19. So when COVID-19 forced schools to move instruction online, teacher-student relationships were completely disrupted, and the nature of these relationships was fundamentally altered. Students and teachers projected digital headshots into a mosaic of tiny boxes on a screen, an impoverished approximation of togetherness, particularly when video was turned off and students' faces were hidden. Gestures that had once seemed insignificant, the offer of a pencil, a pat on the shoulder, a high five, were in their absence realized to be indispensable in establishing the relations of care that support learning in schools. Even when able to be in person together, masks hid smiles and other facial expressions, and social distancing prevented close contact. A shift in teachers' connection to their students occurred. They could no longer rely on the connection and reciprocity that caring for another entails. Teachers could no longer care for their students, they could only care about their students from afar. The quotation here from Lily Miller, not being able to even see their face or their expressions or their body language. I cried for the first month because I was like, I don't even know. Is anyone even there? Is anyone listening? This quotation illustrates just how much of an impact the relational disruption from COVID had on teachers at the time. This presentation explores how these changes to the ways in which teachers were able to relate to students during COVID affected their professional sense of self, particularly for teachers of English for speakers of other languages, or ESOL. In doing so, we see just how entwined the relational side of teaching is with the development and maintenance of a teacher's professional identity. This presentation puts forth findings from a larger multiple case ethnography focusing on how secondary ESOL teachers in Virginia experience and understand the relationships they form with students from other cultural backgrounds. In this study, I conducted a series of interviews with 8 of these teachers using Seidman's method of in-depth interviewing. Each participant sat for 3 90-minute interviews over the course of a couple weeks. My analysis of the data was holistic and inductive with a view towards cultural interpretation. As is typical of multiple case study, each participant's interviews were analyzed individually prior to conducting cross-case comparisons and analysis. This presentation focuses in on one aspect of the study and looks at the question of how the COVID-19 pandemic impacted the experience of cross-cultural teacher-student relationships for secondary ESOL teachers, as well as their sense of professional identity. So what did these teachers have to say about their experience of academic relationships with students during the pandemic? Here are a number of telling quotes. So first, Ms. Potter says, you can't teach and not have the social emotional piece. The social emotional piece is an ingredient that's needed for teaching and the exchange. Otherwise, you're just a presenter. And I think a lot of that is happening right now. People are being presenters. So Ms. Potter really sees a fundamental shift in her work life with students. Teaching has what she calls the social emotional piece, and what I'm referring to as relational. In order to teach, the educational relationship is necessary, and that has been taken away by COVID. She feels demoted, you might say, to the role of presenter. She is just presenting information and not actually teaching because the essential component of the relationship has been taken away. Ms. Tanner says, I'm accepting work now that in the past I would have always helped a child correct and ameliorate. They need a lot. They need more than I can give them when they're virtual. I just can't do that. So Ms. Tanner feels that she needs to lower her professional standards. She needs to accept work from students that she previously would have found unacceptable. And here's another example of an identity shift for teachers during the pandemic of being forced to become less rigorous or less of a teacher. Mr. Cabrera says, we are missing something that makes the world a little bit better. Seeing people smile. We're missing that, and it's a shame. Mr. Cabrera misses the connection, the relationship as a central aspect of teaching. Ms. Miller says, I don't even know who some of those kids are because their screens are blank. I don't have even the knowledge, some of them, of who exactly they are because I can't see them. Now, Ms. Miller also provided the quote from the previous slide about crying because she couldn't tell if anyone was there on the Zoom call. She feels the absence of connection. The formation of relationships is disrupted because she can't recognize her students. She doesn't know what they look like. Ms. Baker says that the huge difference between teaching in person and teaching during COVID is the relationships. I do not have near the relationships I had with my kids last year or the past 3 years. You know, it's December. Normally we'd be a lot further along. I feel like these relationships are still September relationships. I definitely feel that my connection with my kids is not as strong. So Ms. Baker is thinking about the progression of relationships with students over the course of the academic year. By December, during COVID, she is still feeling a big disconnect. She's not able to bond with her students as she has done in years prior, or to build the same level of rapport with them. Her relationships with students are still very formal and feel like they are in the early stages of getting to know one another, even though they've been working together for nearly 4 months. And finally, here is a longer example from Ms. Weaver. Pre-COVID, I'd walk down the hall and find them. And so they don't fall off the wagon because I'm there as soon as they start to be falling. But with COVID, you know their phone number, you call, they don't answer. You text, they don't answer. You instant message, they don't answer. You get on WhatsApp and try to get them. They don't answer. You knock on the door, they don't answer. And you do the whole thing again the next week for the same student, and the next week for the same student, and it's very discouraging. It is frustrating, and I keep telling myself, you can't give up on them. But then you're like, I can't help it. I can't get to you. I cannot go find you. I can't give you what you need, so why do I keep trying to give you just a little bit? It's just not enough for that student or for some others, even Javier. It's disheartening. And that's why I'm at the point where I don't know if he really needs to graduate. I don't know what good it's going to do him, and I would never have said that in non-COVID. So Ms. Weaver feels an immense disconnect with students she can't get in touch with and who don't respond to her reaching out again and again and again. She's at her wit's end, not knowing what to do next. She's tried everything she can think of, and she's starting to give up on some students in a way that she would never have done previously. She's unable to maintain a sense of responsibility for these students because she is not getting anything back from them. And care ethicists and theorists like Nell Noddings and Joan Tronto agree that getting a response from the one being cared for, getting something back, is a necessary component of a caring relationship. Care cannot be maintained without some level of reciprocation. So how can we interpret these teachers' experiences during COVID-19? The concept of moral distress, which was originated by Jameton in the field of nursing ethics in 1984, is quite instructive. He defines moral distress as a particular feeling that comes to be, quote, when one knows the right thing to do, but institutional constraints make it nearly impossible to pursue the right course of action. In situations of moral distress, the difficulty being faced is not actually moral or ethical in nature because the ethical path forward has already been identified. The person suffering from moral distress knows what they should do, but they are prevented from doing it. They want to engage in ethical action, but they cannot because they are prevented from doing so. Moral distress has a strong affective dimension and is felt most acutely by those who perform emotional labor in caring for others. Walsh argues that moral distress often arises when a carer realizes she has been prevented from meeting the needs of a cared for, resulting in a relationship that has become at least partially fractured. We can see examples of this fracturing in some of the previous quotes, particularly from Ms. Miller and Ms. Weaver. This concept of moral distress seems to me to encapsulate what the teachers I interviewed were experiencing during the pandemic. They believed strongly in the importance of relationship building as part of their teaching practice. They felt supportive relationships were particularly important for immigrant students and multilingual learners because of the extra burdens of language learning and cultural adjustment and personal struggles these students were navigating on top of their education. And the pandemic abruptly and drastically upended these teachers' ability to develop and nurture their relationships with students. When these ESOL teachers were no longer able to relate to students in the same ways and at the same level they had previously, they were prevented from teaching their students how they believed it should be done. Over time, the continued experience of moral distress led to a questioning of their professional identity. They lowered their standards and accepted subpar work. They felt downgraded from being teachers to being merely presenters. They felt so disheartened that they questioned previously held moral codes of not giving up on students. The caring impulse central to their relationships with students often went unfulfilled because of a breakdown in central components of care. At times, this breakdown was a lack of response from the cared for, when students didn't respond to teachers' attempts to get in touch, when they kept their cameras off during virtual class meetings, or didn't come to in-person school days, teachers were left feeling abandoned. Their efforts to support their students went unacknowledged, making their efforts to care feel worthless. At other times, the breakdown in care stemmed from the teacher's inability to competently meet student needs, both pedagogical and emotional. So virtual instruction forced ESOL teachers to change their practice in ways they knew to be subpar. Relational connection over the internet was exceedingly difficult, while in-person hugging or physically comforting an upset student in any way was forbidden, and masks covered up reassuring facial expressions. These pandemic-induced changes caused ESOL teachers to question their efficacy and made them lose a sense of purpose. Now that we are well out of lockdown, what's the use of this analysis? Teachers and students can simply go back to familiar ways of relating. So why linger on what happened during COVID? I believe it's important to recognize just how central the relational aspect of the teaching and learning experience is. When the world disrupted our ability to relate to one another, the effects on teachers were profound. If the relationships they form with students are so very important to teachers' professional identities and their desire to do their job well and their desire to continue to do it, we should be paying attention to that and creating conditions in our schools for teacher-student relationships to grow and flourish. In an era of teacher shortages and high rates of teacher turnover and increasingly scripted curricula that remove the personal connection from teaching, this is important. If we want to recruit and retain dedicated teachers, we need to lean into the relational aspects of teaching and take them seriously as both a matter of practice and of scholarship. So thank you very much. Here's an abbreviated list of references for the presentation. And finally, my contact information. If anyone would like to reach out with comments or questions, I would very much welcome that. Once again, I'm sorry not to be able to participate with you in person during this conference, but I thank you for watching my presentation virtually and hope to hear from you. Thank you so much.